Hey there, comrades. Welcome to this week's episode of Red Library, a political education podcast for today's left. As always, hope everyone's doing well out there. Thanks for tuning into the show this week. We're going to mix things up a little bit compared to our first two episodes by doing a mini episode of sorts. Now, on episodes 1 and 2, we tackled a pretty substantial book and really took a lot of time, well over an hour, to dig into that content, to flesh that out with our guest on each show, and to try to really distill the lessons of that work to you, our comrades out there in the leftosphere tuning in. Well, this week, we're gonna tone things down a little bit and bring you a shorter episode. Instead of having on a guest, it's just gonna be me, your host Adam, bringing it to you solo. And we're gonna focus on an article recently published in the newest issue of New Left Review by Marxist sociologist Dylan Riley. Riley's article provides a materialist analysis of the interwar fascist period between World War I and World War II, and then takes that analysis as its starting point for analyzing the ways that fascism is used to describe President Trump today and his base of support. I think he comes up with some very interesting, startling, maybe even slightly shocking conclusions that you might find yourself quite in disagreement with. But here on Red Library, we really want to present perspectives that get you to sharpen and hone your own political ideas, and I can't think of a better way to do that than engaging with an argument like Riley, someone who really is grounding their analysis in the history and the material conditions, which force us to think long and hard about the ways we are using a concept like fascism today. Every once in a while, we'll break up our more substantial episodes with these mini episodes to focus on articles that are very relevant and important and try to really get those out there into the larger public sphere, and hopefully to give everyone a little bit of a break from the larger episodes which take a bit more time to digest. So it's a bit of a breather, even if it's still going to be jam-packed. So enjoy the show, take some notes, and I'll see you back here at the end for a few closing comments. Well, we're here to talk about the big F word, fascism, a word that gets thrown around sometimes very flippantly today in trying to understand the current U.S. political landscape with big bad Cheeto man, the big wet baby president, number 45, Trump, whatever you like to call him. To help us understand a little bit about fascism in general, at least in its classical form, and the uses and maybe even abuses of that term today, we're going to be doing a short reading through a recent article published by sociologist Dylan Riley in the newest issue of New Left Review, issue number 114, if you're into that sort of thing, that came out in November or December of last year. So let's start with a general understanding of the context and the purpose of Riley's article. Dylan Riley is a scholar of fascism and has written actually a great book called The Civic Foundations of Fascism, looking at the way civic foundations, organizations, groups during the interwar period, and again that's going to mean 1922 to 1939 roughly, the way that those civic institutions provided the actual context, the structures of what eventually led to the major fascist parties in Italy, Romania, Germany, all the ones that we know of when we think back to this period and use the word fascism in its most common form today. Now, we should probably say right out of the gate that Riley's particular perspective and what his overall project is in this paper is to provide a much more historically grounded materialist analysis of the way that fascism developed during its classical period, and whenever we use this word fascism to describe Trump and what's going on in the US today, to provide us some different ways, some criticisms of how that commonly gets used, how we commonly think about fascism, and what some of the potential issues are in using this term to understand exactly what is happening right now in US politics. Now, I could see this article being very challenging to read, bringing up a lot of debate, a lot of criticism, a lot of disagreements. I think rightly so. Part of what we're here to do on this show on Red Library is to really present different perspectives among different thinkers on the left, different tendencies, different ways of understanding politics and history, to present those in a way that can provoke you to think and ask questions, to be very critically engaged with maybe even your own perspective on things. So if you find yourself getting to to the end of this episode and vehemently disagreeing with Riley, I would say good. And I hope that you can use his own analysis here, what his own views are on Trump and fascism today, as a way to clarify your own thinking about the subject. Part of what Riley is doing and part of how he sets up his critique of the at least current uses of the word fascism to describe Trump is beginning with a more global international perspective on the rise of very right-wing authoritarian leaders in many countries and not just the US. So right out of the gate, Riley's trying to complicate the typical way we discuss fascism and Trump and what that really means by bringing in awareness of Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines, Viktor Orban in Hungary, Modi in India, Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey, or even Marine Le Pen in France. So we need to already start to think outside the box of this American exceptionalism where we typically focus on just what we know about the US to the exclusion of every other global political movement of which the US really is just one small part. Its role as the global hegemonic power right now means that its part is tremendously huge, but it's still just one part of many. Whenever you're reading something like this, it's always good to ask, who is this in response to? Who is Riley critiquing? Who is he answering? And what I find most sort of intriguing about this piece and why I thought it might be good to share with you all the listeners is that Riley is really responding to people across the entire political spectrum. He's responding to reactionary conservative gargoyle Max Boot, and he's also responding to the eco-Marxist thinker and writer John Bellamy Foster. Judith Butler has gone on record saying that she thinks that Trump is a fascist, and Mark Bray, the anarcho-syndicalist who recently just published a quite popular book on anti-fascism, has said that Trump isn't a fascist, but is enabled by fascist tendencies, and he thereby enables them. All of these different thinkers, from the right wing to the very far left wing, and obviously everyone in the middle as well. Pelosi, standard establishment liberal Democrats who use the signifier, let's say, of fascism to really ground their own political agenda and their own critique against this surging right-wing populist authoritarian movement of which Trump is really just the figurehead. An interesting way that Riley tries to approach this topic is actually by using a reference to the German idealist philosopher Hegel. And he invokes Hegel's concept of what is called the pragmatic form of reflective history. Now, what exactly does this mean? That sounds very fancy, but let's break it down. What Riley is invoking through Hegel here is the way and the tendency to really decontextualize the past, to make it serve as a reservoir of sorts of lessons. And the way that you do this is by collecting a bunch of disconnected moments of either good deeds, noble things that you see happening in the past, or bad ones, atrocious things. And you kind of take all these really disparate, in some ways very disconnected moments or phenomena from the past. You disconnect them from the actual context, you collect them all together and use that as a yardstick of sorts to really measure the current moment. So Riley sees this tendency kind of endemic across the entire spectrum in the way that we use the word fascism today, especially if we're talking about Trump and his little cabal of money-hungry, corrupt, sycophantic acolytes. Basically, it's shots fired on everybody from Max Boot to Mark Bray and John Bellamy Foster. An instructive way to really summarize all of this and what Riley is doing here, the question he wants to ask, is not to explain how our politics looked like 1930 during the rise of fascism in Western Europe and Italy, but why they don't look like that. Now, thinking back to that general collection of far right-wing reactionary figures, Riley makes, I think, a really key point here, which is that most of these leaders, these demagogues, let's say, are so far staying very strictly within the established political forms of their varying countries and locations. And this is something he sees as fundamentally different than the interwar fascist period. So part of what we need to do to understand why that's the case is to really develop a much better understanding of what exactly made those interwar fascist movements much more radical in the way that they were challenging the established political forms, the way that they tried to break out of those, to operate outside of those, and how this essentially is what led them to grab power and to implement the brutal, horrifying programs and agendas that they had. So let's get to the meat of the article. Riley is going to utilize 4 specific areas to help us understand what characterizes interwar fascism. Again, this is the period from 1922, so right after World War I and after the Treaty of Versailles, up to 1939 and the invasion of Poland and the official start of World War II. So these 4 areas are 1, the geopolitical, 2, the global economic crisis that occurred during the Great Depression, 3, the relationship between political parties and civil society, and 4, the general relationship between classes and nation states. Let's start with the geopolitical forces that were at play during this period of fascism and its rise that Riley is really focusing on. The first thing to acknowledge is that whenever we think about fascism in Italy and in Germany, so Mussolini, Hitler, the Third Reich, we can't actually understand the birth of fascism if we disconnect it from the global situation of inter-imperial warfare, and this is very crucial, especially for those of us on the left, the historical upheavals, the revolutionary socialist movements, and victories, and that's very key, the victories of those socialist movements across Western Europe, and obviously the Russian Revolution in 1917, and how all of that provoked an incredibly strong and violent backlash against what we could call internationalist socialism, internationalist workers' movements, and the like. Another aspect of this particular moment was a situation of rampant inflation and unemployment across Western Europe. And an interesting thing that Riley brings up is that one of the initial, and the way that he describes it is almost the most primary part of the fascist political programs, how they garnered their support, how they framed what it was they were doing, was actually to address joblessness. So the fascist movements saw their primary goal as addressing these huge economic upheavals and devastation that were occurring as part of this global economic crisis of capitalism. Now, after World War I ended, and during the early 20s, whatever drops in production, especially agricultural production, occurred, those started to come back. So the former combatant countries, the UK, Germany, France, all of these places, production started to return to its former levels. And part of what Riley is also keying into here is the way that this led to a decreased demand for products because of the increased production, and the way that this led to a sort of explosion of indebtedness in the rural areas. So a lot of the agricultural producers, because of increased production and decreased demand, started to basically have a harder time keeping things afloat. When we think about the Russian Revolution, the successful Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, what we also have to consider is the role that Russia's market played prior to that revolution for the production across Western Europe and the globe in general. So the Russian Revolution's success also removed a key market for where those goods that were being produced, those commodities, where they were going to go and be consumed. So if you remove that market, you're talking about a major shift in global economic relations. Now, around this time, there were also a lot of what Riley calls pre-capitalist agricultural areas across Western Europe and the countries that eventually gave rise to these fascist movements. Riley describes that even though industrial output and production was really increasing and there was a lot more production of commodities there, these pre-capitalist areas couldn't actually consume those commodities fast enough. Consumption has to go somewhere, right? Well, surprise, surprise, military budgets are a fantastic and highly effective way to absorb weak domestic demand. If foreign markets are saturated and there's actually no capacity there to absorb this huge increase in production. And so militaries become a very useful and sort of ripe area to really focus your production into and to really decrease that surplus that you have. Another aspect of these classical fascist regimes, partially a consequence to this, is that imperialism and the war economy become absolutely primary. Now, whenever you combine that with what Riley calls the reformist imperialist ideology that was dominant and the way that colonialism for most of the Western European countries and the U.S. at this time as well. Let's not forget that the U.S. was waging its first colonial expansion in the Philippines in 1898. So around this time, being an imperial empire was a key attribute of great world powers that were dominating the globe at this time. One thing that Riley does mention is whenever the fascist regime in Italy started to take power, one of the first international and imperialist actions it took was the genocide of a half 500,000 Ethiopians in Abyssinia. So we can't think of fascism without this very destructive imperialist force that's a core part of its political agenda and what it does whenever it gains control of the state. Part of what imperialist ideology did in having a core imperialist project was to really give a sort of coherence to what might have been a fairly incoherent and contradictory set of economic policies. For Riley, it's going to be an imperialist project that remains explicitly capitalist, and by that we mean explicitly does not challenge relations of private property. So there is economic planning in a fascist economic program, but unlike a more leftist socialist communist program, there is a strengthening of private business and protecting excess capacities in existing industries. So the next time someone tries to make the argument that the National Socialist Party or Nazis are socialists because that is in their name, basically ask them if they know what private property is, and then proceed to correct them ruthlessly if you need to with some of the things you might learn in this podcast that we're doing right now. We also have to understand that at the time, the German Social Democratic Party, or what's called the SPD, that they were actually backing the austerity programs being suggested by most politicians as a response to these economic crises of capitalism. So at the time, the Social Democratic Party, what was supposed to represent the internationalist workers movement, the left in a broad sense, they were backing the austerity programs, and the fascist movements essentially provided some sort of response to that, something that could, for the average workers, would give some sort of hope of a way to addressing this economic devastation and to provide some sort of corrective to that. Keeping these things in mind, this leads us directly into the second area that we're going to focus on, and that's the relationship between political parties and the social classes, the working classes of Western Europe and Italy around this time. The idea was always, at least in a pretty straightforward surface level reading of Marx, is that the bourgeoisie, the middle classes, historically, were always the ones that set the revolutionary process in motion. They basically initiated the revolution, were the most radical force in a society, and then they would essentially be teachers of sorts. They would instruct the lower classes in how to both struggle against the old order and to combine with them to help destroy it. A key distinguishing feature of fascist ideology and the fascist political projects from, let's say, a socialist project was to find some way to weld together a political party, a mass movement across different class formations. Now, what does that mean? Well, simply it means that as opposed to just being workers against the capitalists, bourgeoisie against the proletariat, fascist parties really welded together a whole range of different groups. This could be salaried employees, small shopkeepers, some segments of the working class, not many, but some, and a whole lot of petty agrarian producers. And they organized them into this paramilitary nationalist formation, which saw as its primary enemy international socialism. Another key feature of the aspect of political parties in all of this is that in the US, political parties were dominated by pro-capitalist interests. This is something that still continues today. We can't really understand the idea of a political party in the United States without understanding its relationship to pro-capitalist forces. Now, in Italy and Germany, they did not have, at the time of fascism's rise to power, any sort of pro-capitalist parties explicitly. Socialist parties tended to dominate, or at least were a much bigger part of the picture, hence our discussion of the SPD, in which fascism rose in opposition to. Fascist parties in places like Italy and Germany provided that piece of the puzzle that the US had, which they did not. And again, just to correct any horseshoe theorists out there, the word socialism does not define something as being inherently socialist. You have to look at its program. You have to look at its understanding of capitalism, of private property, of the relations of production, wage labor, all these sorts of things. Now, an interesting little historical nugget here is the Strasser brothers in Germany, which have been called left fascists, and which they actually were the ones who were trying to weld fascism onto a sort of mass, kind of more socialist, welfare state-oriented program. And basically, they failed horribly. They were not effective, and even today, most fascist movements, most white supremacist groups look at any sort of Strasser-type approach as being fundamentally anathema to their project. So nation states help to weld together different groups across classes and to really oppose them to something more internationalist in scope, and those were fundamentally tied to working class movements, working class organizations of socialist and communist character. Part of what we can think of is that fascist movements were able to overcome divides between agrarian and industrial capitalists, and the way that they were able to forge alliances between export-oriented capitalists and more of the state-supported industrialists. So these two different blocks tended to have very divided interests, but under the general umbrella of a fascist political party and mass movement, they were able to align under common interests and align under a common identity. And part of the economic platform of fascist parties was to repress wages and to provide direct economic assistance for the dominant classes through their preservation of private property, the state's support of industrial manufacturing sectors and capitalist interests as a whole, and the way that all of the production of society as it blossomed after the First World War was able to be directed into the war economy and manufacturing sectors. An interesting structural piece of how fascist parties were organized is they directly mirrored Communist Party formations. They focused on having a cadre as the leadership, and what really mattered was your ideological adherence to the aims or the line of the fascist party, and the primacy of participating in struggle would forge one's ideological sort of character and political commitment. After the fascist parties gained strength and started to come into power, you would also see a type of second revolution against the bureaucratic elements of the party, and these were directly supported by the fascist leaders themselves, and it helped to reinvigorate the party, reestablish its momentum, and to help push it into new areas of organization as well. And just to return to our geopolitical piece that we started with in Riley's analysis, these imperialist, revisionist national parties of fascism, in Germany and Italy in particular, were really excluded from the larger imperialist game that countries like the US, Britain, some of these other Western European powers are playing. So Riley really wants to focus on the way that they had secondary status in terms of the larger imperialist global landscape. And that helped to drive this deep sort of ideological adherence and primacy of an imperial project. And so whenever fascist parties come into power, they're taking the imperialist ideology and expanding their own nations, their own empires, building empires, and then also turning those same techniques internally into their own populations. So now let's take all of these different factors that Riley uses to characterize the classical interwar period of fascism and to use that as the basic historical analysis that we can then turn on the 21st century and the situation of Trump and US politics at home, and to look at how these two things match up. One key feature that we see here is that there is no great war that Trump and his cabal are arising in response to. There is no complete material and economic devastation across an entire continent. There isn't that base trauma underlying the growth of a huge mass political movement, and there isn't a corresponding rise of a vibrant and militant left-wing movement that was international in scope and focused on mass organization of the working classes. The features of war and military conflict that we find ourselves engaged in and that Trump is emerging out of is actually the war on terror. We have no army that necessitates a mass draft. We're talking about a voluntary military force. And this force relatively has minimal blowback in Washington. So there isn't that same level of mass engagement by the population in the military industrial complex and sort of fighting the wars on the ground as a whole, in any way even remotely comparable to the situation during the First World War. If you look at the economy, the standard of living now, despite stagnating wages since the 1970s, is still relatively much higher. The rate of unemployment in the US now is obviously, I think, around 4.5, maybe 5% now, and there's probably a discussion to be had about whether that accurately captures the state of employment and joblessness in the US. If we were to talk about communities of color and their rates of unemployment, we might be looking at something somewhat similar, but in terms of the broad society as a whole that encompasses all different demographic groups, very different situation. And we are also responding to the 2008 economic crisis, the recession, and even though that is something that we could somewhat compare to the Great Depression after the First World War, the recovery of that has at least been partially successful for the moment. And just to return to our unemployment numbers, even during the 2008 crisis, unemployment never rose above 10%. And we have to compare that to the 25% unemployment that was a common feature of the era of interwar fascism, again from 1922 to 1939. Debt is a main factor in the economic landscape today, as opposed to mass joblessness and mass deprivation that came along with the Great Depression. And this sort of experience of debt as a primary individual experience fundamentally does not collectivize people in the same way that a sort of mass wave of joblessness did. There is no mass paramilitary formation the same way that there was in fascist Germany or Italy. Now, we can talk about small individual paramilitary groups, but despite the sort of media attention that we put on these, a group of 15 to 20 white nationalists organizing somewhere in Texas or somewhere, around a Capitol building or a particular statue is not in any way the same order of mass movements of thousands upon thousands. Now, another interesting feature here is we have to look at Trump's platform of a kind of protectionist nationalism versus outright imperial aggression and global warfare. Now, a recent event that I think Riley doesn't discuss, but is very relevant for this, is the sort of strange, unanticipated way that Trump is starting to make actual moves to pulling the U.S. out of Afghanistan, out of Iraq, out of Syria. And it does at least point to some kind of way that we can understand this much better through Riley's framework in terms of how to understand Trump versus just essentially labeling him a fascist and the sort of things that we imply whenever we use that word. We also find that there's a real key hostility to sections of the elites in business, such as GM, Google, Amazon, that characterizes Trump's tweet storms, his viral meltdowns. And this is fundamentally different than the alliance between fascist parties and industrialist and capitalist interests during the interwar period. And in some way, we can't really see Trump as having any sort of strong connection to his actual class. So in contrast to thinking of Trump through the framework of fascism, which I think Riley does make a pretty good case is very hard to do, or it's at least requires calling it something else besides fascism in its classical sense if we're going to look at it that way. Riley offers a different way of thinking of Trump, utilizing the great German sociologist Max Weber's ideas about the three different forms of rule. Now, these three different forms we could think of as being one, charismatic, which is people leading by their own sort of energy, their charisma, and that's what galvanizes people to join around them and to support them. A patrimonial type of rule, and this is a much more almost pre-capitalist form of rule where the leader is almost functioning like a father figure. And third is perhaps the most common one in our era, which is the bureaucratic form of rule. Institutions, rule of law, policies, procedures, these are the things that grant authority to any sort of leader, and his operation within those bureaucratic processes is really what gives him legitimacy or gives them legitimacy. Now, if we think about Trump as some weird combination of all three of these, it helps us to understand a little bit more of what we can actually see and study about his actual political project and what his administration looks like. Part of Trump's struggle, and one factor that came up during the initial stages of his presidency, was the way that he wasn't able to actually staff a lot of the bureaucratic agencies that make up the U.S. state at the moment. Part of the interpretation of this was it was a deliberate, subversive strategy trying to hollow out these agencies and some sort of fascist takeover of the U.S. state. Well, Riley's perspective actually sees this as a failure of Trump's ability to actually have a strong enough network, a strong enough cadre in which he could actually staff these agencies sufficiently. And Riley really sees this as kind of a slowdown that is a consequence of Trump's distance from the Republican Party establishment as a whole, as opposed to any deliberate strategy. Now, there's a lot of discussion about Trump really being an authoritarian, and what is opposing him are these sort of democratic processes. And James Comey, the intelligence agencies, the security apparatuses, they seem to really want to cast it in this light, and the Democratic and Republican establishment does as well. But Riley really sees the main way to understand what's happening here is that there's a certain adherence to legal processes, to laws themselves, to the rule of law, and Trump's kind of weird patrimonial style is what they primarily find most sort of disgusting and disagreeable to them. But at the end of the day, they're not necessarily defending any sort of democratic process or democratic values. We're talking about the same agencies that not too long ago were exposed for conducting the most horrifying, egregious mass surveillance program that anyone could imagine, that were responsible for extraordinary rendition, torture, all sorts of war crimes all across the globe. So we have to question whenever the CIA or the FBI says that they're the defenders of the democratic process, let us not forget that what they've represented has actually been the exact opposite. So for Riley, what he offers us, as opposed to Trump as a fascist in any sort of classical sense, is he's actually better characterized as some weird, contradictory combination of these patrimonial characteristics, along with trying to be a charismatic leader at the head of a failing capitalist, imperialist, state and hegemonic power. Because of this contradictory set of qualities that he has, he really, at the end of the day, is failing to accomplish any real way to consolidate power if we compare him to the interwar fascist regimes, which were incredibly brutal and effective in doing just that. And an interesting way that Riley focuses on the charismatic leadership part is he actually describes Trump having as what he calls postmodern charisma, which doesn't have any clear ideology, which is transmitted to the inner cabal, the inner cadre, and then is filtered down through the masses. So whatever postmodern charisma is, it's something that is not fundamentally supported by a strong and solidified cadre organization directly connected to the masses. It functions in a way that postures in a particular way but has no substance. And if we think of Trump this way, there is no point of dedication that will sustain and help organize people together, specifically under the identity of Trump, once he leaves office. It's not to say that white nationalism won't still be there. Some small fascist groups won't still be there. It doesn't mean that the economic situation, the geopolitical situations won't be there, but there's nothing about Trump himself in the same way that we could characterize fascist leaders during the interwar period. There's nothing about him specifically that's going to persist and help organize groups together around him and his personality and identity. And Riley closes his piece with maybe the most damning criticism of anyone who calls Trump a fascist throughout the entire article. And he basically wants to drive home that to continue utilizing the word fascist to describe Trump objectively aligns whoever uses that particular approach behind the general democratic establishment's agenda. And this goes back to the importance of understanding the real conflict here being between legality, between the established order versus this weird combination that Trump embodies. And we have to conclude here and drive home that anytime someone like Nancy Pelosi or Bill Clinton or Chuck Schumer or anyone that's an establishment Democrat essentially says you must oppose Trump because he is a fascist, be very critical and very wary of what you must then assume, who you must side with, and who are your allies if you are going to use that language. So let's close out. What do we take from all this? I think that Riley's analysis here is very helpful, if nothing else, to have a much more concrete and materialist understanding of what exactly it was that gave rise to fascism as we know it. Now, I think there are criticisms to be made of Riley's article. I think his discussion of the way that overproduction was a major factor in the rise of classical fascism after World War I has some weaknesses and leaves a lot to be desired. And to really say that anyone who calls Trump a fascist is objectively lining themselves up with Pelosi and the Clintons is also a pretty damning criticism, and one that I think people like Judith Butler probably be very quick to criticize and respond to quite aggressively. But at the very least, I think that what Riley's article does is it challenges a common sense understanding of what fascism is, challenges the way that the establishment order is using that word and understands its power to help criticize Trump and also to take attention away from their own agenda, from their own purposes, their own political programs, and the way that those things also support capitalism and support the growing inequality, wealth disparities, racial violence, all of these different things. It's very easy to plaster over those whenever someone throws out the words fascist. But as good dialectical thinkers, good Marxists, good socialists, good communists, I think we have to always return to having a concrete analysis. And hopefully what Riley provides to you, and I think what he has definitely provided to me in terms of ways to think about this and ways to challenge my own understanding and use of these words, is that whenever we use a word like fascism, we can't disconnect it from its historical context, from the material conditions in which it developed, and we have to ask really hard questions to ourselves and to others about how that word continues to be used today, and if it doesn't do the job good enough, then maybe we have to find another word to do so. All right, comrades, that does it for episode 3 of Red Library, a political education podcast for today's left. Hope you enjoyed the show. Hope you enjoyed coming on that ride with me through Riley's article, his analysis of the classical period of interwar fascism. Again, I think some of his conclusions here are pretty challenging, and you may have found yourself disagreeing pretty strongly throughout the episode in hearing some of his points and how he was understanding and trying to analyze what Trump exactly is and what's the best way to talk about his political reign of terror, reign of ineptitude, however you want to think about it. We really hope that you enjoyed this mini episode, and you can expect more of these every so often just to break up our normal, regularly scheduled programming where we have a guest on and we're going to delve into a much longer and more substantial book. As always, if you like what we're doing here on Red Library, please subscribe on iTunes, write a review, follow us on Facebook, and consider heading over to our Patreon page and tossing us a few bucks to support the work that we're doing, as this is a real labor of love for myself and for the few others that we have working on the show so far. Next week, you can look forward to Comrade Alex coming on to talk about Slavoj Žižek's Lenin 2017. It's going to be a massive theory fest. It's going to be the Fast and Furious film franchise of theory, and I think you're really going to enjoy Alex's perspective, his ideas, his creativity, and how he interprets not only Žižek's writings, but Lenin and other leftist theorists as well. So look for that episode to drop next Sunday, and until then, stay safe out there, stay strong, keep on fighting, doing all that great work you're doing, and we'll see you back here next time.